It's American Pageant, Chapter 8, Mr. Shea for Notre Dame High School, AP United States History. We pick up with the Second Continental Congress. Second Continental Congress is much more significant than the first one because during the Second Continental Congress, at this point, fighting has broken out. Lexington and Concord has taken place. And now the delegates, although when they show up, aren't discussing it in with any real motivation or determination, I should say, but the idea of independence is going to be introduced. We also have the appointing of George Washington to be general of the colonial army. So obviously they actually create a colonial army, so that it's a big move in and of itself. He's sent to Massachusetts to assist in the siege of Boston. Some of the concerns with George Washington, he really doesn't have a ton of military experience. He's not really a military genius. What makes George Washington a appealing figure or general is basically his character. He's extremely honest. He is respected. He has great courage. He's very generous. He has a sense of, it says justice here, but also a sense of national identity. He believes in the cause, so he is willing to lay out his own expenses, use his own resources, and obviously volunteer himself towards that cause. There's George Washington's portrait after Yorktown. Okay, so what's going on, as far as fighting goes? Well, between 1775 and 1776, there are little skirmishes and smaller battles that are fought. The most famous one being Bunker Hill. I think I have another slide that shows a picture. We'll show it momentarily. Bunker Hill was General Howe and the British regulars marching up the hill 3 times. The first 2 times, especially, just being slaughtered due to the entrenched positions of the Patriots. Eventually, they take the hill because the Patriots just run out of gunpowder. But if the British had to fight battles like that all the time and suffer the amount of casualties they suffered during that one battle, they wouldn't be too successful. So, although the British did take the hill, it's considered an American victory. Arnold and Allen's capture of the garrisons of Ticonderoga, you'll see it in the film John Adams, was also very important so that the cannons could be placed around Boston Harbor and used to eventually make the British retreat. So the Second Continental Congress, the members of the Congress they're still split on whether or not to move forward with a military campaign, to move forward with independence, and whether or not they want to try to make peace and resolve their issues with Great Britain and King George. They try the Olive Branch Petition, one last petition pledging their loyalty and hope that the king will come to what they consider his senses. But the king rejects it wholeheartedly and proclaims the colonies in rebellion. Now, this is significant because now the colonists are rebels. So, as rebels, if they're caught, they'll be hanged for treason. That's a big difference. So, that along with George hiring Hessians, these German troops, really signaled to the colonists his seriousness. The colonists were very upset by this because they felt that this should be handled within the British family, so to speak, and bringing in outside mercenaries who were known for brutality was especially telling of what King George felt towards the colonies. So in New England, it's not just in Boston. There's other fighting in other places. One of the strategies that the Continental Congress put together, along with Washington early on, it was the idea of invading or assault on Canada, possibly adding a 14th colony, and cutting off not only economically but also militarily another strategic point for the British in North America. It's nearly successful. Montgomery was able to capture Montreal, but eventually he was killed, and Benedict Arnold was also shot and injured in their attempt, and they failed. Oddly enough, even though this was a failure, Arnold's forces would remain in the area as they retreated back towards the 13 colonies or towards Maine, and he would be very useful later on because his men and him would almost be forgotten by the British. Eventually, the colonists or the rebels, the Patriots, are able to force the evacuation of British soldiers from Boston. This was uh, a huge point for the. This was a victory for them, and because of the cannons, again taken from Ticonderoga, put on Dorchester Heights, surrounding Boston Harbor, this victory signaled the seriousness of the Patriots, but also the escalating of the war because from here the British are going to commit thousands of troops and hundreds of ships, and they're going to head primarily for New York, which will be much more difficult for the Patriots to defend, and ultimately they won't be successful in that defense. Some other smaller victories, although significant, we have to remember when we see loyalists, loyalists were fighting in the colonies. Loyalists were those loyal to the crown, or Tories. They were fighting against the Patriots. So sometimes there were battles fought just between, you could imagine, two militias, one being made up of British loyalists, one being made up of American patriots, and they would have similar supplies and things, especially early on before the loyalists are provided with more ammunition and military supplies from the British Crown. But in 1776, 15,000 loyalists are defeated, and then also an invading fleet, and this was not loyalist, the British fleet in Charleston Harbor in 1776 were turned away. This is just a depiction of Bunker Hill. If you could really imagine the top of Notre Dame's hill down towards that McDonald's down there, and imagine the British forming and trying to march up that hill. If they do that once and you have this vantage point down, the soldiers entrenched at the top, really easy to knock off the British troops, tough for them to march up that hill, and then to retreat all the way back down, and then how to send them right back up. And they retreat again after suffering heavy casualties, and from how to send them right back up again. If they had more ammunition, they would have really annihilated all of the British in that battle. So the movement gains for independence gains incredible momentum with Thomas Paine's publishing of Common Sense. It's the phenomenally successful pamphlet that outlines the case against fighting for reform versus fighting for independence. Common Sense is written in a way that the ordinary common person can easily pick up and understand. The language that is used is very relatable. It's not aristocratic. It doesn't come across as something that would be written in a law book. It also puts forth the idea, and it's quoted here, that the government's powers should come from the consent of the governed. So this is a very new idea, and this is the idea of republicanism, as I know one of the slides is going to have more on there. But this slide is just talking about how successful the pamphlet was. 120,000 copies were sold. It says where in the physical universe did such a smaller country control such a larger, vast territory. And he's trying to point out that not only is it common sense that the American colonists should be independent, but it's also equally as evident that the American colonists have the potential to be much stronger and greater, even militarily, than Great Britain, and so don't fear this separation. So when you look at it, Thomas Paine, because he really outlines the ideas for the new government, he outlines a Republican-style government, which I'll talk about in later slides. I don't want to jump ahead. And he lays this framework and this idea. So when we really look at it, it's common sense is the foundation for the Declaration of Independence, and for the country's initial forming and the type of government it's going to have. Just a map. We talked about. Sorry, guys. Get the mouse and the thing just switches on me. It just shows you some of the battles that are taking place. There's Benedict Arnold. Okay, here, his defeat. and then he's going to retreat somewhere in here, and he's going to kind of get lost in this area, and that's going to be very significant at Saratoga in 1777. He's going to play an important role, which we'll come back to. But if you want to remember this map, right here is giving you an idea of where that took place, and this will be the turning point of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Saratoga. We'll also look at this map in class, but you can see some of the other battles we're going to discuss, like Princeton and Trenton, Brandywine and Germantown, which are defeats for the Patriots. But we'll come back. So Paine called for a republic. It's not the first time a republic has been discussed in history, going back to the Greeks and the Romans. And basically, a republic is a government where powers come from the people, and it's not a pure democracy in that not everybody has a vote on every issue, but everybody is represented in every issue. And all government officials, directly or indirectly, are chosen by the people. Now, I just want to jump ahead here a second because I'm kind of talking. Now, not everybody was in favor of this. Some people felt that this would give too much power to the ordinary citizen and not maybe the most educated or politically well thought out person. But America did have a history already of this type of government in its local assemblies, whether it's the Massachusetts Assembly or the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So it was already something that it was very American, this idea of a republican government. In a republican government, the citizens must understand that they have to put their self-interest aside for the public good. So there has to be law, there has to be rules, and because these people are citizens are electing their representatives, they are giving these representatives the ability to write these laws and enforce these laws, and that's for the public good, for the good of the whole. Again, coming back to those people who felt this was a dangerous system of government because it took away the ability of those more qualified to lead to be chosen, and the wrong people might be chosen to lead, and therefore the country could be led in the wrong direction. Although it's settled with the Constitution in 1790, eventually, and we're going to go through another Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, prior to that. But even though in 1790 it's settled as far as the Constitution, and it seems like it's a republic formed in the spirit of democracy, there's still going to be a debate for quite some time over who has true say. For example, the Electoral College is set up as indirect election of the president. Part of the reason is because these individuals who were against possibly just a pure republic didn't think that individuals had the ability to choose by themselves accurately the best person to lead the country. Remember also that senators were not initially elected directly by the people. Another safeguard against a pure republic. So Henry Lee, and we saw in the film, calls for and they're successful in a vote for independence, but they felt that it needed more of an explanation, so a committee is formed. The movie goes a little bit out of order here, but that's okay. And Thomas Jefferson is eventually charged with writing the Declaration of Independence. He's an extremely qualified writer, and the Declaration was intended to outline the reasons why, to make a case for, and defend what the Patriots were doing. So the Declaration of Independence is formally approved by Congress on July 4th, 1776. That's why we celebrate on that day, July 4th, every year. The Declaration is really broken down into, it could be four, some people say four, some people say three parts, but let's just, you have the introduction, let's say one, so the preamble, introduction, and then the complaints against the king, 27 actual complaints against the king, and then finally the Declaration of Independence. The history of where these names come from, really from political groups back in Old England. Whigs, we remember, was that opposition group in England towards the monarchy, always suspicious of the monarchy, and the Tories were really opposed to the Whigs as a political group in England. So loyalists become nicknamed Tories. Sometimes patriots call the British call patriots Whigs. Not every person in the colonies served or was a patriot. Remember that many were against the Revolutionary War. Some just tried to stay out of it. They didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to lose their land. They didn't want to lose their family. So it really came down to militiamen. And if you ever seen the movie The Patriot, although it's not a very good movie historically speaking, it does depict in the movie Heath Ledger and Mel Gibson as two colonial leaders, militia leaders, their father and son in the film. But you see them traveling from town to town to try to recruit. The son meets in a church and attempts to recruit and is successful by speaking about the cause and really trying to inspire people. And Mel Gibson goes he goes to a tavern where he needs less motivation because of that particular area. There's more of a hatred of the British. But the point is, it was up to these militia units and leaders to recruit and spread the word and get more people involved in the revolution. You see some of the stats here. The numbered 16% of the American people. Oftentimes, it would split families apart. You can imagine brothers or fathers and sons. Your book mentions Will Franklin, Ben Franklin's son, who was a staunch loyalist. He was a Tory. He was a governor of New Jersey, and he stayed true to the crown. And remember that we look now revisionist history and we say, oh, these traitors, they were being loyal. They were taught to be English citizens. They were taught to be loyal to the English throne, and they remain loyal. It's not that they were bad people. They just felt that it was the right thing to do to be loyal to the crown. It makes sense why most loyalists resided in Anglican. Remember, the Anglican Church is the church connected to the Church of England. Primarily, you find a lot south in some middle colonies, New York, parts of Pennsylvania, surprisingly, were extremely Tory. In New England, you wouldn't find it because remember, Congregationalists, they were very separate. They weren't involved as much in mercantilism. So it makes sense based on the history of the past century that we studied why Britain would find more Tories in the southern middle to southern colonies. So before the Declaration, these Tories are treated mildly. I mean, mildly, sometimes tarred and feathered, especially if they took a British job. Sometimes just outward spoken words. Maybe they were not involved in an organization that they were involved in before. But as time moved on and the Declaration of Independence is written, now it becomes a little harsher. The treatment becomes harsher and harsher and harsher, where eventually there are Tories who are murdered, hanged, and patriots also on both sides, imprisoned, and many begin to flee towards British lines. And you see here 80,000 eventually are driven out towards British lines or back to Great Britain. Their estates are taken over by the government and used to fund the war. Many of these loyalists would actually join the British regulars. Others would serve as spies. So the Loyalists and the Tories are a constant battle that George Washington and the Continental Congress has to deal with, this enemy from within. So George Washington's army, compared to the 35,000 or so soldiers that are sent over by the British on hundreds of ships into New York. Now Washington got there early. Remember, New York is a little bit of a Tory town at the time, New York City. He tries to establish armaments. He tries to establish cannons, circling the port. But the port's just too huge. They don't have the firepower, and there's too many ships coming in. They do battle at Long Island, and it's really only because it was a foggy morning, and they were able to sneak by the ships that otherwise Washington's army would have been completely taken, and very likely the war effort would have suffered a blow that would have been difficult to rebound from. Washington eventually escapes towards the Delaware River, and he'll begin to move south after a few more smaller battles and defeats. Now, General Howe makes a reappearance. Remember him from Bunker Hill. He had an opportunity to take Washington when he was, cross the Delaware River, take him. He could have done that. But one thing to remember is soldiering back then during the winter was not something that was normal. Many times armies would retreat for the winter and reconvene fighting when the weather got warmer. It was almost like an off season, or because it was too dangerous to just live out in the cold and not hunker down, as Washington finds out. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But he had an opportunity, but he's cited as saying he learned his lesson from Bunker Hill, not to take too many chances, but also what's equally as true is Howe's personal life. He enjoyed the comforts of city living in New York. He enjoyed the company of a mistress, and he was in certainly no rush to move away from there during the cold weather. So Washington takes advantage of this on December 26, 1776, with a sneak attack on Trenton, surprising and capturing over 1,000 Hessians the morning after Christmas. A week later, leaving the fires burning in his camp, they cross the Delaware and successfully defeats a small British fleet at Princeton. So these victories, although small, were extremely important because at this time, Washington's enlistments were beginning to run out. And they were struggling to find new volunteers due to all their defeats in the New York area. These two defeats are victories are widely publicized, and it does a great deal for morale, bringing in more volunteers and keeping the war effort, in the spotlight and energetic. The British come up with a strategy, and the strategy is basically to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, and that would be a severe blow. And they're going to do this, in the Hudson River Valley, and the idea is that Burgoyne would take his troops down. I showed you the map. I think I tried to circle where that battle is going to take place, Saratoga, and he would move down Lake Champlain route from Canada, and then Howe's troops would come up and meet Burgoyne, and then they'd be able to essentially split New England away and then work their way back down. But they run into a lot of roadblocks. One of the roadblocks is Benedict Arnold. He has that force that was defeated at the attempted invasion of Canada. They're in the area, and while they're trying to construct a fort and a crossing, they had to get across the St. Lawrence River. He needed to build things there. So they established camp. It took a long time, and Benedict Arnold begins to attack and force Burgoyne to engage in these battles, which Burgoyne eventually wins. Although Arnold isn't capturing like that, but he eventually wins. But that delay cost him, so now he had to retreat all the way back again to Montreal during the winter because it would be too difficult to maintain in the cold in the woods. And then the next year, he's got to start all over again at the same spot. If he had been able to kind of go along with their initial plan without Arnold's intervention, it's pretty certain that they would have been successful in their strategy. George Washington, learning of Howe's idea and plans, Howe also kind of abandons Burgoyne. He wants to take Philadelphia, which is the capital. Washington tries at Brandywine Creek and Germantown to defend, but loses both battles. Howe eventually takes Philadelphia, but again, then gets bogged down there. He enjoys the life again. He's content at staying in Philadelphia when he shouldn't have been. Washington, meanwhile, retires to Valley Forge with his soldiers. Brutally cold, not enough supplies, a Tory area, so they can't find food and resources. Washington loses several volunteers to death, disease, and some who just begin to look to abandon their posts. However, in October 1777, because Howe did not go to help Burgoyne, and Burgoyne was very slow and working their way through the dense forest, as he takes his time to work through that dense forest, the Patriot forces in the area, militiamen in the area, are gaining in size, gaining in size, gaining in size, and then they take the opportunity to attack. And Burgoyne realizes he's surrounded with no opportunity to get out, and surrenders his force of over 7,000 men. This is a huge surrender to Horatio Gates in 1777. And the Battle of Saratoga is really considered the turning point of the American Revolution, because at this moment it shows, it demonstrates. Remember that Ben Franklin's in France right now trying to negotiate a treaty with France to get them more involved in the war beyond just supplies and money. And the Battle of Saratoga demonstrates to the French the capability of the American military to act and defeat a large British force. So that this is extremely important victory during the Revolutionary War. King George, just gonna go through this. You can see the clubs. These are supposed to be patriots and I believe Tories, forcing them to sign some type of document. This is a British cartoon depicting the Americans as Indians chasing Tories, scalping Tories. This is King George's statue being ripped down in New York. This is Washington crossing the Delaware, a very stoic crossing. His leg up. It was rough. He probably wasn't as stoic, but you get the idea. You see the horses in the background. It's actually supposed to be 3 units during the crossing. I believe Henry Knox's unit couldn't make it. Couldn't even get the horses on the flatbed boats. So France, why does France get involved? Remember that the American Revolution is never won by the Patriots if France doesn't get involved. France wants revenge on Great Britain from the French and Indian War. America needed France for its money, for its military power, and for especially its navy. So America had a very different idea when you think of diplomacy, and Ben Franklin and John Adams, their plans for diplomacy. They didn't want colonialism. They didn't like the system of mercantilism. They thought that if you opened up trade between countries, that it would create a natural alliance, that it would lead to prosperity and thus peace for everybody. America also wasn't interested. You look at the model treaty here outlined by John Adams: no political connection, no military connection, only a commercial connection. So they're saying to France, we want a treaty. This is the model treaty. We don't want to be your subjects. We don't want to be your colonies. We are going to be an independent nation. Okay, so they're able to get this treaty signed eventually, but it's going to have a military connection to it. Ben Franklin was really the perfect man to go over. He traveled to Europe many times. He shows up. He doesn't wear the normal garb. He doesn't wear a wig. He wears his little hat. He looks. He doesn't carry a traditional ambassador sword. He's very plain, and he symbolizes. He's trying this intentionally. He symbolizes to the royal court that this is America as he sees it. This is America is going to get beyond the traditional aristocracy, the traditional royal to do over these things, and just come in there and be able to talk plainly about what both sides needed. He was really loved in France for this. After the Battle of Saratoga, Great Britain does make an offering for the colonials to actually self-govern. People don't normally talk about it, but they had an opportunity to get what they really wanted pre-revolution. Unfortunately for the British, the Americans were too far into it and had too much success at this point to want to go back to being under British control. And they didn't trust the British that they would keep their word. So they decide, but it was important because it really pushed the French further. Once Ben Franklin is able to use this information, the French see the need to move swiftly and actually ally themselves immediately with the Americans. And so France in 1778 officially signs a alliance with the United States. This is important for a couple reasons. One, obviously, military support is coming, naval support is coming, but also the fact that a country like France had officially recognized America as an independent nation. That's a big deal. And there's Ben Franklin, his very plain clothes, his bifocals. So with the signing of that peace agreement, the whole landscape of the war has changed. It's not just in the colonies, more between Britain and America and some Native American tribes. Now it's a world conflict. France has entered, Spain will enter, Holland will enter, all against Great Britain. The armed neutrality led by Catherine the Great, Russia, brought together all the neutral countries, the countries that weren't going to participate militarily, but they were going to use other means, trade laws, economic means primarily against Great Britain. So Great Britain now felt enormous strain all around them, and with this victory for the colonials gains a great deal of momentum. So your book outlines, what Americans deserve credit for, and it says that, they kept the war going, and then, once France comes in, they provide over half the troops and the Navy, and that's true. There's no question. But Americans, I think that quote kind of shortchanges the American contributions post 1778, which were legitimate and substantial. We have to remember, again, going back to the last slide, that it was the American militiamen who were able to really keep Cornwallis at bay in the South, even though it was the French regulars and the Navy who eventually made him surrender without the militia. And that was happening after 1778. Okay, so Britain has to change its strategy. They have to also protect their homeland. In America specifically, they, in the North and Middle, focus and return their men from Philadelphia to New York and focus on that area, very Tory area. And then they also focus on Cornwallis in the South and hoping he can work his way up from the South, and then eventually they'll bring the troops back from New York to meet in the middle. Just a couple pretty indirect points here. One is the French army in 1780 when it lands with 6,000 regular troops in Newport. Not much of a contribution, not really a need in that area for reinforcements. Probably intentional by the French in some ways to say they landed troops, but they're keeping them out of harm's way intentionally since there's no real fighting going on in that area. Benedict Arnold turns traitor in 1780. Not shocking to, although Washington was probably shocked, but not shocking to historians considering Arnold's history, self-motivated, opportunistic, and he saw an opportunity for riches, and he took it. So Cornwallis's moves, Georgia, and then moving through South Carolina, but it's here where the colonists begin to make stands. Indian-style attacks, and coupled with the victories at Kings Mountain and then Cowpens. Cowpens was a pretty significant victory against British regulars, which was not the norm. Usually British regulars were fought in Indian-style attacks. To beat British regulars on the open field of battle was a huge move forward. The person given credit to most of the Carolina campaign is Nathaniel Greene. And as time goes on, he continues to attack, then retreat, use their smaller size and their knowledge of the land to move Wallace and frustrate Cornwallis in the South. And Cornwallis does become very frustrated with Nathaniel Greene, who's nicknamed the Fighting Quaker. And here along the red lines, you could just see some of Cornwallis's movements. Here we go again. Okay, where they move their way into Charleston, up here into South Carolina and then parts of North Carolina. Okay, and here is Cowpens and Kings Mountain, significant Patriot victories. And I'll stay on this slide for a second because we're going to get to Yorktown. But you see Cornwallis moves his way back down towards the shore, probably resupplied here in Wilmington, and then moves his campaign in 1781 towards Virginia, where he's pushed back and wrongfully thinks, probably just like in Wilmington, he's just going to resupply here in this area of Yorktown, Portsmouth, Norfolk, but he's wrong. At that point, de Grasse comes in. He's the French naval captain and brings the ships in and surrounds Cornwallis. Okay, so what was going on in the West? Well, the British were offering money for scalps to Native American tribes, and so you have the tribes split who's fighting for who. Uh, and you see the Oneidas and the Tuscarora side with the Americans, while the Senecas, Mohawks, Cayugas, and Nondagas joined with the British. And they're mainly led by Joseph Brant. And he believed in a victory for Britain because he believed that the British would do a better job of keeping the colonists from wanting to, or allowing the colonists from expanding westward. And that's why Joseph Brant believed it was important that they support the British. Eventually, the colonial government, American government at this point, the Congress, understands this threat, commits a more substantial force, and throws down the Native Americans in the area. And they sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which is the first treaty signed with a Indian nation. In the Illinois region, and this is not significant because of numbers or because it was a major victory, but George Rogers Clark wanted to take several of these smaller forts that were probably originally French forts but are controlled by the British, but very small forces. And he believed that he could take several of these forts, in a short amount of time. And he's successful. And they were very popular victories in the Ohio River region. Even though they weren't large victories, they were popular. But also, they showed a little bit of American control in this region, which is going to be very important when we talk about the Treaty of Paris. The Navy, even though America didn't have a large Navy, very few ships, they did have individuals like John Paul Jones. And he was head of the Navy, but also probably the orchestrator of organizing all the privateers. And what the American Navy slash privateers did best was disrupt British shipping by attacking British merchant ships. These privateers looked at it as a great opportunity financially for them, but also a way to serve in the war effort. One of the only negatives would probably be that the people who served in these privateer ships were soldiers that couldn't be used by the American Revolutionary Forces, but the gold supplied through these raids of British merchant ships was invaluable to the Congress who was trying to fund a war. There's Joseph Bryant. There's Clark's route. So 1778 to 1781, a very difficult time during the war. The government is struggling to fund the war. Its loans, it's only to pay a very small interest rate. And really, when you think about it, they're paying a very small interest rate, and they have enormous risk attached to them. So that's a hard sell to raise money when you're offering that interest rate, and you don't even know if your nation's going to succeed. It's very difficult to get investors to lend you money in that situation. So it was the colonists were definitely in need of a big victory. They get it with Cornwallis. He made the mistake, as we said, I showed you on the map before, of heading towards the Atlantic again, looking for supplies, believing that the Navy was there to help him. Did not understand that the French saw this as an opportunity and that they were going to be trapped once they were at Yorktown. Kind of talked about this already. Except that Washington also, once he hears that the French are going to commit their naval forces to going after and trying to trap Cornwallis, he slips out of the north where he was stationed with his troops in New York, combines up with a large French force, and they're able to surround Cornwallis and eventually force him to surrender 7,000 men October 19, 1781. It's the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. It signifies for many, to be the end of the war. However, fighting still went on, skirmishes. George III did not plan on giving up. George Washington did a great job during the next year of keeping the pressure on the colonists to keep up the war effort, keeping his troops mobilized, even though there wasn't as much fighting going on, until a treaty was actually signed, so that there was no sense of weakness or opportunity for the British. Okay, so what happened as a result of the Revolutionary War? Well, for one thing, we have to remember the Whigs have gained quite a bit of power in government. Everybody was tired of the war. The French were tired of the war. The British were tired of the war. They wanted to end it. Um, and so the treaty itself is extremely advantageous to the Americans. The three individuals sent to negotiate peace were John Jay, John Adams, and Ben Franklin. They were supposed to consult with the French on all aspects, but it's important to remember that the French had made deals with the Spanish and so on and so forth, and that Jay suspected the French may have had ulterior motives in in um, in how they wanted peace to come about, and so Jay makes secret overtures to the British to get the treaty done, and they don't really look to the French till after the fact, but they do a good job of really getting the French off the hook with what the French had promised the Spanish. Okay, but America gains immense land. So to start a nation with so much land and so much potential wealth at its disposal was phenomenal. Britain acknowledged the independence of the United States, which is also very, very relevant. And for Great Britain, they were really, because they made this peace and they were so generous with the peace, it really allowed for them over to rebuild their military and emerge in the next decade as the preeminent world power. Okay, so what were some concessions the Americans made? Tories, loyalists were not to be persecuted anymore. They asked that Tories be given their land back. Um, but a lot of these things were never really carried out. Okay, I already mentioned these points. You could take a quick look at them. And here we see, remember we saw the earlier cartoon, I think in the previous chapter, of these two fighting, and now you see the American princess with the old world British princess hugging, and it's the reuniting the mother and daughter country. Okay, guys, that's chapter 8. Good luck on the quiz.